Welcome to the Bible and Science. This is Dave Prentice. I'm a retired public high school teacher, certified in all branches of science and math. I've also taught on the Bible and Science for many years, both in the U.S. and on many overseas mission trips. This is episode 37 of the Bible and Science. We started talking about fossils, some general principles, and we're going to continue on with that for the next several episodes. This one we're going to talk about the general order in which fossils are deposited and how fossils are created in the first place, and this has to do with their supposed ages. If you believe in creation, you're going to have certain ideas about fossil formation. If you believe in evolution, you're going to have very different ideas about fossil formation. Fossils are most often found in large groups. In many cases, the groups of fossils, which are known as a suite of fossils, like a suite of hotel rooms, they're used to identify the rock layers, the strata, in which they're found. So these fossils indicate this is a Cambrian rock, an Ordovician rock, Devonian, and so forth. There are many large-scale fossil graveyards around the world. They contain millions or billions of fossils buried in water-deposited sediment. So where did these things come from? If you believe in creation, initial complexity, you would expect that the strata containing large numbers of fossils were probably formed under catastrophic conditions when a great deal of sediment was deposited around the world in violent events such as either one worldwide flood or even local floods, and then also volcanic eruptions. If you believe in evolution, which says slow, steady, gradual processes, you would expect that the sediments were deposited a tiny bit at a time over millions and millions of years, and then they eventually consolidated into rock. There's a principle called uniformitarianism that says the present is the key to the past, and that includes the idea that there has never been a worldwide flood. There's also something called Steno's law of superposition, which has been around for several hundred years, and Steno said that the layers on the bottom have to be the oldest. Well, we'll get back to that in a little bit. But this is the foundation of the evolutionary timescale, uniformitarianism. It doesn't mean you have to wear a uniform. It means you believe everything happens at uniform rates. Uniformitarianism is the geological statement of faith. It's not testable. It's a statement of faith that says everything happens by slow, gradual, steady, uniform processes. Or it's frequently expressed in a slogan, the present is the key to the past. That is, there can never been a worldwide flood in the past because there's not a worldwide flood right now. This is what Peter told us to look out for. 2 Peter chapter 3, the Apostle Peter, writing almost 2,000 years ago, told us what would happen much later. This has been in the last few centuries. Peter said, first of all, you must understand this, that scoffers will come in the last days with scoffing, following their own passions and saying, where's the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things have continued as they were from the beginning of creation. They, the scoffers, deliberately ignore this fact that by the word of God heavens existed long ago, and an earth formed out of water, and by means of water, through which the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. Peter said, look out for this. In the last days, scoffers will say three things. Number one, Jesus is not literally coming back. Maybe it's spiritual or something. And the scoffers will continue to say, from the beginning, everything has continued at the same rate. From the beginning of creation, slow, steady, gradual rates. And the third thing the scoffers will say is, never worldwide flood. There has never been a worldwide flood. Never been a worldwide flood. Gee, why am I emphasizing this? This is the foundation of the geologic timescale of the evolutionists. The thing I mentioned before, the law of superposition, Steno came up with this several hundred years ago, and he said that the sediments on the bottom are always the oldest. Well, I beg to differ. Mount St. Helens, as well as lab experiments, have showed us that this is not the case. That's what Mount St. Helens looked like in the state of Washington before its eruption in 1980. It was a classic snow-capped mountain. The ages assigned to the strata depend upon the law of superposition, which was formulated back in the 1600s. It says in undisturbed rock strata, the oldest rocks are at the bottom. Well, it's not a law at all because it's been falsified. Rock layers are almost never undisturbed, so you can't apply this to it. Steno's law applies only when the sediment is deposited quiescently, quietly, gradually, just a slow deposition of sediment. If there's any sort of a flow, then it throws it out the window. It doesn't work. The mud flows at Mount St. Helens show that if sediment is moving, the bottom layers may not be the oldest. This is what happened at Mount St. Helens up in the state of Washington. When the volcano erupted, it deposited mud flows that ran along very, very rapidly, sometimes 80 miles an hour. And when they did, they would lay down the first little skin and another little skin on top and another little skin on top and another little skin on top. There were hundreds of feet of finely deposited laminated sediment deposited there, and it wasn't over the space of hundreds of thousands of years. It was that the sediment was flowing and it laid down one skin, another skin, another skin, another skin, another skin in just a matter of a few days. So that picture is by Raymond Fleischmann. There's a wonderful visitor center up at Mount St. Helens. I encourage you to go there. It's one of the most impressive things I've ever seen. So at Mount St. Helens, there's a canyon on the Toutle River. The 1980 eruption filled the Toutle River Valley with hundreds of feet of superheated mud. It rapidly hardened into rock. That was followed by a second eruption about a year and a half later in January 1982. It sent more superheated mud blasting through the newly formed sedimentary rock. And the new flow formed a network of canyons up to 160 feet deep, which is 1/35 of the scale of the Grand Canyon. How many millions of years did it take to form that canyon you see there in one day? The Toutle River did not carve the canyon. It just drains the network of canyons, commonly called Engineers Canyon. And fossils are generally going to be found in sedimentary rock, not granite. I just wanted to show you this so you can take it for granted. This is a place at Mount St. Helens called the Goat Rocks. These are granite. Granite supposedly takes extremely long periods of time to erode. Well, there's a canyon shown there through the Goat Rocks at Mount St. Helens. That's hard rock erosion. It's supposed to take millions of years at least, but the steam blast during the initial eruption of Mount St. Helens carved out a 700-foot deep canyon through the Goat Rocks. How many millions of years did it take? Now, one afternoon. Geologic processes can happen fast. The law that I referred you to before, the Steno's law of superposition, no, it's not a law at all. There are too many exceptions. I want to refer you to some of these. You can go back to the description page of this podcast and you can get these links. There have been some wonderful experiments done by Berthaud and Julien. So despite the so-called law of superposition, there have been large-scale lab experiments by Guy Berthaud and Pierre Julien at Colorado State University. and later Berthoud did more in Russia, the experiments showed that layers formed by flowing sediment look like those formed quiescently, except the layers on the bottom are not necessarily the oldest. The layers form in the direction of current flow rather than from bottom to top. They go left to right or right to left, whichever way the current is flowing. So the eruption and the later mud flows of Mount St. Helens confirm that Steno's law does not apply to fast flowing sediment. Hundreds of feet of mud deposited tens of thousands of finely laminated strata over the space of just a few days. The strata were not thousands of years apart. They were all the same age within a day or so, rather than 10,000s of years apart. So if you go back to the description of this podcast, you can copy those links and paste them in. Berthoud and Julian have done experiments that you can observe, watch it on Facebook, at those locations. And Steno's law of superposition. One time I was teaching an earth science class to high school students, and one of them was really paying attention well. Okay, so on the test, I said, what is Steno's law of superposition? And this one guy said, well, some positions are so great that they're superpositions. Yeah, that's what public school teachers face. There are some contrasting beliefs about how the fossils were formed. There have been hundreds of billions of fossils discovered around the world. For instance, the Karoo Formation in South Africa is estimated to contain perhaps 800 billion. That's billion with a B. That's 3/4 of a trillion or 4/5 of a trillion. That's a lot of fossils. So how were the fossils formed? If you believe in creation, initial complexity, you would say living things came into existence in a complex condition, and they didn't take millions of years to develop into the terminal forms we find in the fossil record. So you look at a dog and you say that's a terminal form. Well, what was halfway toward the dogs? As a creationist, I would say, no, there was nothing. They were created as terminal forms, not transitional forms. And I would believe that animals and plants buried quickly enough could become fossils under the right conditions. And I also believe that many of the fossils, were probably produced as a result of catastrophic processes. Now, if you believe in evolution, which is initial disorganization with increasing complexity, you would believe that animals and plants evolved one step at a time over billions of years, maybe slowly, gradually, maybe in sudden jumps, but regardless, they evolved over billions of years. And then you would believe that as sediment was accumulating in bodies of water, animals and plants dying next to those bodies of water fell in and were buried. Then eventually the sediment hardened into rock. After millions of years, the rock eroded and it exposed the fossils, which we now find. So here's a question. How do you make a fossil? If I catch a fish and I throw it on the sidewalk in front of my house, how long will it take to form a fossil? It won't. It's going to rot. Or if I catch a fish out at the lake, near Lake Pontchartrain, and I throw the fish into the water, the dead fish, how long will it take to become a fossil? Won't happen. It'll rot. It'll get eaten by scavengers. Go out, if you hate animals, go out and shoot a cat and throw it in the lake and see how long does it take to form a fossil. Boy, I just got somebody mad at me, right, talking about shooting cats. But you have to bury the thing quickly so it doesn't rot. And then also, if you want it to fossilize, that is to have a mineralized outer layer, you have to make sure the minerals are there, the right kinds of minerals in the mud or in the water. And then you have to apply lots of heat and pressure. So how long does it take for this process to happen, to make a fossil? Let's say chicken bones. How many millions of years? Let's say crude oil. How many millions of years? Well, this is something that's been done repeatedly. Chicken bones have been turned into well-mineralized fossils in laboratories in 5 to 10 years. Bones, insects, resin, things like that have been turned into fossils sometimes in a single day under the right conditions of heat, pressure, and mineralization. Ooh, okay. How about fossil fuel, crude oil? Organic garbage, banana peels, leaves, and so forth, has been turned into crude oil, otherwise known as fossil fuel, in as little as 20 minutes. It doesn't take millions of years. It can take as little as 20 minutes. You have to put enough heat and pressure on it, and that energy will be stored inside the fossil fuel. This is one of my favorite things. I took a trip to South Africa some years ago, and my friend Joshua Gilbert gave me some spark plugs. They're often used as fishing sinkers in Durban, South Africa. The water in the harbor has a very high concentration of minerals, and sometimes the fishermen throw the lines in the water and the lines get snagged and they break. Well, Joshua goes swimming in the harbor and he brings these things back up. So those are actual spark plugs that were used as fishing sinkers, and they became coated with minerals, and they look like fossils in just a few years. Now, if you've ever watched the Flintstones cartoon on TV, I joke around that these are Flintstone spark plugs. So let's talk about the ages on the geologic column. It was pieced together from many locations around the world. When more than one layer, one stratum is present, the order is fairly consistent worldwide. However, look at that complete geologic column and tell me, where can you find that? Only in textbooks. It doesn't exist anywhere in nature. In fact, every layer can be found out of order somewhere in the world. The ones that are supposed to be lower may be found higher. So that would tell me, oh, maybe something's wrong with this idea that they were gradually accumulating over millions and millions and millions of years. Initial complexity creation would lead us to expect certain things in the fossil record. We would think that not all of the earliest animals would have been preserved as fossils, but many. The major types of animals and plants were present from the beginning, or almost from the beginning, during the creation week. There should be many types of living things in the lowest fossil-bearing layers. And we also would expect that the majority of fossils were probably formed under catastrophic conditions, such as floods and volcanic ash flows. When we look at what's going on in the world today, let's see if we can apply this idea that the present is the key to the past. We see in the world today, animals and plants live in interdependent ecological communities, which are called biomes. The fossil record should hint that prehistoric conditions were probably kind of similar to this, that things would have been dwelling in communities, interrelated, interdependent communities. So we would expect there should be clear-cut worldwide patterns of fossil distribution indicating distinct ecological communities around the world. Here are some examples of what's in the world right now. Animals and plants live in interdependent communities or biomes, which vary according to climate, elevation above or below sea level, and so forth. In Colorado alone, there are 8 ecosystems that you'll see, depending upon the things like the rainfall and the elevation above sea level, and many other places. In Texas, there are 7 distinct biomes. So when you put them all together, you're going to find that there are probably a few dozen biomes found throughout the world, ecosystems. So If you go to various museums, which I like to do, you can see illustrations of this. There are several dozen distinct biomes in the world today. So if you believe in evolution, initial disorganization, you're going to have some very different expectations about what you ought to find in the fossil record. The very first living thing would have belonged to only one kingdom, one phylum, one class, one family, one genus, one species, and so forth. So as time went on, after a while, a second species evolved, and then a second genus, and then a second order, and a second class, and so forth. So as time went on, there would have been more and more and more types. Evolution says that the strata don't represent ecological communities, they represent time periods. So the fossils on the bottom are the oldest. We would expect that the fossils should increase in complexity as you go higher and higher and higher up the geologic column. Evolution is the idea that things began in their minimum of complexity, and then through whatever means, whether you think God did it or whether you think it was just random chance, they increased in complexity and genetic information. So evolution would say that most fossils were formed slowly, steadily, gradually under uniformitarian conditions. That's what Peter was prophesying about in 2 Peter. And there has never been a worldwide flood, according to evolution. So all of the changes that have happened since the beginning would have been by mutation, random copying errors. So if that's the case, animals and plants would have been evolving at different rates, at different times, in different places. There shouldn't be any sort of a clear-cut worldwide pattern of distinct communities. So what do we actually find out there? Different types of living things, from bacteria to humans and everything in between, would have had to evolve at different rates in different places at different times. There should be no worldwide pattern of clearly defined communities of fossils, but that's precisely how we identify rocks. We look to see, is there a community of fossils in this rock? If so, it's a Cambrian, it's an Ordovician, and so forth. Geologists don't use radiometric means, radiometric dating, to identify each rock layer. No, they look by a fairly clearly defined suite of fossils, an assemblage of fossils that's fairly uniform no matter where you find it anywhere in the world. So the age of the rocks is determined by the fossils, and the age of the fossils is determined by the rocks. That's circular reasoning. Where do we find that complete geologic column? Nowhere. Nowhere in the entire world. The single most complete section of it is found at the Grand Canyon in Arizona on the Colorado River. So the layers that you do find there are the Permian, Pennsylvanian, Mississippian, Devonian, Cambrian, and Precambrian. All of the other ones are missing. All of those shown in red, those rock layers are missing. They're just not present at the Grand Canyon. You may find them somewhere else in the world. Well, you will find them somewhere else in the world. But the most complete section of the geologic column in the entire world is at the Grand Canyon. It contains only 6 of the strata. And the gap from the Cambrian to the Devonian is supposed to represent over 70 million years of missing fossils. Now, if you read Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, he believes that life came into existence in some warm little pond. Well, this is frequently called the Oparin-Haldane hypothesis. A.I. Oparin and the British biologist Haldane, J.B.S. Haldane, they looked at the things in living things, at the chemicals in living things, and most things In fact, everything is made of, at minimum, CHNOPS on the periodic table: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Now, there are many, many other elements involved as well. You need iron in your blood, you need chlorine in your digestive system, and so forth. But at a very minimum, you need CHNOPS. So they were trying to figure, Oparin and Haldane, how can we explain life apart from God? Well, let's leave out the sulfur and just work with the carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. What common gases have those things? And they said, well, okay, methane, ammonia, water vapor, and hydrogen. Those have most of the elements that we're looking for in a living thing. So they came up with the Oparin-Haldane hypothesis that says that these were sufficient to put together enough amino acids to produce the first living things. Well, okay, Darwin believed that life began around sea level over 3 billion years ago. But we're going to get into the Precambrian and the Cambrian fossils probably in the next episode. The Precambrian fossils are ocean bottom dwelling creatures. They're supposed to be the oldest living things. Okay, life came into existence supposedly at sea level, but the oldest things we find are at the bottom of the ocean. So why would the first living cells, which were suited for life at sea level, dive many miles, 6-7 miles deep, to get to the bottom of the ocean so they could then begin to evolve back up? And think about this. Can you swim that deep? The very first living things would have had to be able to dive all the way down from sea level to the level that we now call the Precambrian. How would they survive that? So if you look in the picture there, you'll see that's a photo I took at the Denver Museum, and that's the actual apparatus that Dr. Stanley Miller used to test the Oparin-Haldane hypothesis. And way back when, in a much earlier episode, you could look up the origin of life and find out that doesn't work very well. But why would life dive down to the bottom, and how would it survive? Okay, we'll be dealing with specifics about the fossil record, some characteristics of the Precambrian, Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, and so forth as we go on. This is just sort of an introductory part, and I hope that you find this is useful. I am a Bible-believing creationist, but other than one reference to 2 Peter chapter 3, I think you'll see there's a great deal of science that you can use to support the concept of creation.